Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diaspora
Conoscere.
Falando.
Diaspora sta de parler.
Diaspora spricht.
Diasporas speaking.
Përshëndetje, my name is Rina Limoni and I'm the host of Diaspora Speaking. In this episode, I will be joined by Dr. Catherine Baker, where together we will explore how Balkan popular culture has shaped and been showcased in the Eurovision Song Contest. Welcome to Diaspora Speaking, Catherine.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to being here.
As you perhaps might have heard before in this podcast, we start the conversation with 3 questions. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And what do you do in your day-to-day?
So I'm from London and I grew up there as well. I went to university also in London, and then I moved to Southampton for my first academic job after my PhD. Then I moved to Hull in 2012. So I lived in Hull for a long time. I live somewhere else in Yorkshire now. So what my day-to-day looks like is, if I'm working on campus, probably I'm commuting early in the morning, I'm working on campus, I'm coming home again. And if I'm working from home, then I am shifting myself the entire length of one room to another room and doing pretty much what I would also be doing on campus most of the time.
So what you would be doing on campus is research, teaching, and the teaching closely relates to the Balkans. So my question at the very beginning is, I will ask it this way. Would you say you chose the Balkans, or did the Balkans choose you?
I think it was definitely a choice in the sense that I knew when I was a high school student, when I was a university student, that probably whatever the next stage of my career was, it was going to involve doing doing something else with another language, with translation, with local cultural knowledge. And, I think I had already understood by that point the histories and the cultures that I was interested in, which felt like they were part of my world, were not just those that surrounded me in the United Kingdom, were not just those that surrounded me in the English language. And if we go back to when I was an undergrad, I think the 2 places that consistently I wanted to understand best and know the most about, one of them was the post-Yugoslav space and the other one was Spain. And, back in our school system, you had much more opportunity to learn about Spain, to study the language, to visit it. And if I hadn't ended up meeting people and doing things which connected me more to the post-Yugoslav space, I might very well have ended up doing very similar things to what I do now, but for Spain. It was the same set of issues, I think, which I could see were there in both countries, and subconsciously, I was aware on a level I didn't necessarily think about immediately, but of course there are also issues which, really structure how we think about and experience belonging here as well. Spain, Yugoslavia as it was, and the United Kingdom, they're all multinational countries. Huge debates about what does the national identity of the multinational country look like. Huge debates about what do the national identities within that country in each space look like, and how have societies coped with and managed or not the memory politics that come with that, the clashes of narratives and historical experiences there were going to be. For some reason, it was easier, I think, to understand those in the sense of being able to notice when those dynamics are happening and then try to make sense of them and what we can get revealed through them, through that extra bit of distance, which comes from actively having to learn rather than just learning from what's around you, I guess. The next step, which was an important step in sort of thinking through these connections was, I think understanding that, okay, well, I can recognise these in Croatia, I can recognise these in Spain, and also that ends up equipping me more to understand them in national life in the United Kingdom or the other country that you got almost as much of a window into, even though you really didn't, which was the the United States, why we expect in Britain that we keep up with the day-to-day of what's happening in America in a way that through the mainstream media we don't in larger Western European countries, let alone anywhere on the peripheries of Europe, is a question that doesn't get asked enough. But one of my first experience probably of encountering critical ways of thinking about nationalism was reading Dubravka Ugrešic's work. And, she was a writer who was very, very critical of the culture of compulsory patriotism. As soon as the war broke out in Croatia, pervaded the media even more than it had done through the months leading up to independence. And trying to reconstruct when I would have read that, it must have been in probably 1999, maybe 98. I was definitely still in high school because I found the book in my local public library. And at that time, most of what you would read in the general audience books on the region that were out there, it would tend to be the very sort of celebratory versions of small nations' history. Obviously, the fact that Croatia had to fight a war for independence in the 1990s is a really important part of its history that I do not want to minimise. I don't want to minimise the sacrifices that any sort of individual person or family went through, or the fact that that was not a war that had to happen. It was a war that could have been stopped by international powers very easily, and they didn't do it. And now we have the consequences. As can be the case even in wars which nobody in society apart from a tiny fringe wanted, the atmosphere of patriotism within a war can still become very coercive. And, there are certain societies and certain wars which have handled that more pluralistically than other examples. Croatia's was an example where it was very, very difficult to dissent in any way from what the presidential narrative of the war or the country's national identity was. And Ugresic was somebody who was very much writing against that, saying actually the experiences and the identities and attachments of the plurality of Croatian society do not fit into this small box that a president and state institutions have defined as the only way that you can belong to this nation. So that was the position that Ugresic was coming from. It was the position that the alternative Croatian media was coming from. And, so this was the first time I'd really encountered Croatia's nationalism being written about in anything like that way. That was, something that I don't recall now exactly how did I process it at the time. But okay, I need to change the understanding of Croatia and its history and its politics, but until then I'd had. So that would have been at the latest in the year 2000.
You're touching on popular culture. And the reason we are having this conversation, it's popular culture because it's Eurovision. Is the Balkans a reason you got interested in Eurovision?
Well, I think it was Eurovision, but ended up opening up more understanding about the Balkans in the sense that I was first watching it in 1993. That happened to be the first contest where a number of Central and East European states were participating for the first time. Got Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia. There was independent states. Obviously, they'd been involved with Yugoslav entries before, plus beginning to get broadcasters from other states which had never participated during the Cold War. It was sort of this picture of what's often called European enlargement. And I want to resist that language in the sense that A, who determines what size Europe is anyway? B, to the extent that it has enlarged, it was always that size anyway. So it's not a question of parts of Europe suddenly predeterministically appearing in it after the Berlin Wall comes down or anything like that. But it was almost the whole of Europe was participating, was already a routinized thing. And this happened to be the first edition of this thing that I'd ever seen. Obviously, you also had the narrative about Bosnia's participation. If anyone ever tries to tell you that, using Eurovision for public diplomacy during wartime is only a 21st century thing, then it very definitely isn't. And Croatia and Bosnia participating in 93 in different ways with different kinds of narratives and, different kinds of musical heritage behind them were very, very much proof of that. But over the course of the rest of the 90s, that was the first place I heard popular music in most other European languages. And I think, again, the idea that you could express the sentiments of popular music in any language, not just English, which you're always being implicitly told in this country, is the dominant language of music and popular culture and everything else. I think A, that was important. And B, as I got to understand sort of more about, okay, well, what's actually going on in any of these songs, you could always find out what the lyrics meant, because they'd always have to put English and initially also French translations up somewhere. So for anyone who is beginning to learn any language that's in Eurovision, you've got an incredible resource already there. And I think sort of through that, I started understanding, again, without really being conscious of this, okay, that actually the ways people sing about things like love, romance, desire in different languages exceed how we're used to hearing about those in English language popular music genres. And obviously, sort of looking back from 25 years later, one of the things that really characterises popular music from all around the Balkans is how much there is about longing, for instance. And as a queer young person who didn't really know what to do with themselves or how to express things, then I was sort of accidentally hearing music that was expressing some kind of, I don't want to say analog necessarily, something that was touching some of the same sort of sentiments in a way that you didn't really get in the English language popular music that was around.
You somewhere say that Eurovision explains everything. I know, I remember following your work on Twitter, and then you wrote that on tweet, and I don't remember precisely. Could you unpack that for us? What does that mean?
I think I said that in a slightly flippant manner in my Twitter bio at one point, when we could actually communicate things on Twitter. And I don't even remember now exactly when I put it there. But, it was definitely after the contentions around all the clashing narratives and strategies of public diplomacy we've seen through Eurovision in the 2010s. What has happened basically over the years since I've started thinking about this event, I never actually set out to research Eurovision as an objective. It came naturally into the work I was doing for my PhD about popular music, national identity in Croatia. I didn't expect it to necessarily. It turned out that right when Croatia was declaring independence, Croatian television was already so keen on getting into Eurovision in 1992 that it went through the process of selecting an entry, even though actually it couldn't get its international recognition and then its European Broadcasting Union membership through in time. So there was that side of it. How did Croatia want to be seen using this platform in the 1990s? And then right in the middle of my PhD, Croatia had, almost the biggest scandal in Croatian television and popular music history around Severina's Eurovision entry in 2006, essentially because the media decided that it sounded too Balkan, too Eastern, too Serbian. And those are the three things in that dominant version of Croatian nationalism, again, that has been so prevalent in the 90s, that nobody and nothing authentically Croatian should ever be. And of course, as soon as we start talking about cultural heritage and folklore, it's always more complicated than that. And this was a song that was picking up on elements of folklore from the Dinaric hinterland in Dalmatia, basically. So things that had been there since before the present-day national borders, essentially. And it ended up sort of perfectly capturing, perfectly expressing pretty much all of the dynamics that I knew I was going to have to cover in this thesis anyway. It was an absolute perfect storm of cultural anxiety happening. And so I couldn't not think about Eurovision after that. It was clear that you didn't just need to think about Croatia for understanding what the scandal in 2006 was about. You also needed to see what had other countries' broadcasters been doing. How were those, how were influencers circulating? How might creative teams have been trying to compete with each other? Everything that was going on in terms of nation branding and in terms of trying to use repackaged folklore in a very sort of knowingly modernized way. That Turkey had won with this, Ukraine had won with this. So, okay, what were the cultural politics going on behind that? In as far as I was able to learn more about those backgrounds, which was less than I'd have the opportunity to do today if exactly the same set of scandals was happening today. I want to give a shout out to Maria Stronovitska's work here. She's a ethnomusicologist working on Ukraine. She's Ukrainian in her own heritage, and I wish her book World Music had existed when I was first writing about Ruslana. So now I'm in a position of not starting because I'm quite a nice way through the draft now, but working on a monograph on Eurovision at last. And I can look back on what I've written about the Balkan entries in that time during the 2000s. And, there was work with Sonovitskis, but, really kind of refreshes and recontextualizes what I was talking about in those first kind of attempts. So I ended up researching Eurovision, wrote a couple of articles about it, which came out in 2008. It was clear that there were more researchers sort of beginning to notice, okay, Eurovision actually is connecting with things that they're thinking about in other contexts. So you start seeing more academic publications coming out. I then went to not a completely different project, because again, there's questions of localness and internationalness, Europeanness, which still come up in it, but a different project looking at interpreting language and translation, international peacekeeping in Bosnia. But while I was doing that, I was still blogging about Eurovision, and I mentioned Twitter earlier, and sort of blogging and Twitter together from about 2010 onwards was how I used to both learn about and then try to work through a much broader set of questions in sort of social and cultural theory, feminist politics, queer politics, than what was directly part of my academic work at the time. So every year, I do at least one post on Eurovision, depending on what it was that I'd been thinking about politically, what the politics of that particular year were, what was going on with national European belonging in the host country that was significant, for instance. And the way that I'd been able to think about Croatia through what happened with Severina, for instance, then I think about consciously becoming, okay, I can do that in admittedly a more limited way because I don't have access to the same range of languages. But, that's a way that we can think about, every other entry, every other hosting going forward. What it ended up meaning was, over time, I had thought about a lot of different current social, cultural, political issues as they affected Eurovision, as they affected different countries, different national contexts. Conchita Wurst obviously won in 2014, and then the international reaction that her win had, both the narratives sort of in support of her and the narratives that were resisting her gender transgression. There was so much wrapped up in them about how is Europe being defined and associated with certain values, where are its boundaries, what are people saying about the eastern peripheries of Europe within all this. And those were bread and butter topics to anyone who works on pop folk music in the Balkans. But, suddenly they were also relevant to explaining these international queer politics, as of course they'd been when Maria Sharifovic won in 2007, and Belgrade in 2008 then has to work out what's it going to do with these thousands of gay tourists that the tabloids have said are now going to be descending on Belgrade. I've been going over some of that for the monograph, actually, and, I'll keep back the details for the book, but I always had the hunch that the politics of having Eurovision in Belgrade in 2008 were more connected to the politics you get over the state's relationship to Belgrade Pride in the 2010s, and then what the president tried to do with the appointment of, Ana Brnabic, this openly lesbian prime minister. I'd always have the sense there was more connection between those contexts than really been talked about, and I think in the monograph, hopefully I've been able to bring that out a bit more, make it a bit more concrete.
And we are very curious to read the book, especially coming from you. Of course, if you feel revealing more, I'm very happy to listen to it. But then you speak also about values in Eurovision. And I'm curious to know whether there is a noticeable shift in how the region was represented in Eurovision under Yugoslavia, beyond the fact that there are multiple entities in Eurovision now. So between then and now, is there a continuity, or would you say there is a difference in how have values shifted?
Yeah, the big difference, just as you said, is we're now talking about multiple nations sending entries from what used to be a single multinational space. And the way that Yugoslavia chose its entries, it would have a mini Eurovision, essentially, for the TV studios of the different republics and provinces within Yugoslavia. If you look at which studios were doing best and which studios were least well represented, clearly that reveals the same kind of constitutional inequalities across the federation that we see everywhere else. So really quite a lot of the entries coming from Croatia or Serbia, especially of course from the Belgrade studio, a little bit from Slovenia, a little bit from Bosnia, and nothing from Teve Pristina ever made it to the Eurovision Song Contest itself, even though it was there in the Yugoslav along with all of the rest of the studio's entries. So, that tells us something, I think, about how the politics of Yugoslav television and Yugoslav entertainment culture work. So the big difference, obviously, is multiple nations being from the space being represented at the same time. There are situations where, and we were talking about Croatia and Serbia earlier, and that's a situation where one of those nations is the exemplar of what's on the wrong side of the symbolic boundary markers of national identity in a lot of the ways in which Croatian national identity has been imagined. So got that multiplicity of post-Yugoslav broadcasters competing. I think sometimes there is competitiveness between the broadcasters, especially in the 2000s, I think, when they had the most to invest in it. So as soon as Serbia-Montenegro, as it then was, comes second in 2004, if Svetlana hadn't been there, Željko Joksimović might have won. And I think you can definitely see broadcasters and creative teams in, especially Croatia and Bosnia, after that, looking around and thinking, okay, A, we need to keep up with this, and B, there is a formula there that we can make work equally well for us. And if you were Bosnian television, you can actually hire Joksimović to contribute to writing your entry, which they did in 2006 with Harry Mata Hari. If you're Croatian television, at that time, it's going to be a national scandal if you do that. You can end up with Goran Bregović being your arranger in 2006 for this entry of Severina's, and then almost be the same amount of scandal broke loose as if it had been Joksimović. So the relations between broadcasters, can then see sometimes sort of being expressed in the contest. They'd obviously got each of the post-Yugoslav broadcasters that was able to send entries that would be understood by people who spoke the polycentric language and understood well enough by people speaking Slovenian and Macedonian. Also, knew that there were potentially 5 other countries which would be very likely to vote well for it in what at that time was 100% public vote. And what this then meant, when you got post-Yugoslav entries doing well, you would then get this discourse in Western European countries of they're voting for each other for political reasons, or they're voting for their neighbours, or so on and so on, which overlooks just how integrated all of these entertainment cultures still were, despite the breakup of Yugoslavia, despite everything which had happened sort of during and since the wars. And secondly, if there were post-United Kingdom entries in the contest at the same time, don't tell me exactly the same thing wouldn't happen, because these would be the musicians that people were seeing on what at the time would have been their mass media, now their social media feeds all the time. So one of the first blog posts I remember writing about the cultural politics of Eurovision was about 12 different reasons why this discourse about neighbourly voting, block voting was so infuriating and so embedded in this asymmetric way of thinking about who gets to be European, who gets to be thought of as rational and objective versus, who's going to be thought of as irrational, led by their emotions, and making non-objective decisions. So that is the gist of my Eurovision voting rant. There's a lot of things, I think, actually, where there's continuity between how Yugoslavia approached Eurovision and how post-Yugoslav broadcasters do. Obviously, all of this is happening in an evolving, transforming broadcasting technology situation, and then a digital media, digital production, digital design, evolution as well. But honestly, the same sort of identity dynamics. Should we send an entry which is more international in style? Should we send an entry which is more specific to ourselves? If it's more specific to national traditions of ours, which one are we going to pick and send it out there in this contest where it's going to look like it's representing the whole of the nation? And there's some great work by Anita Buhin, for instance, who is a cultural historian. She's looked at how did Yugoslav television manage Eurovision. And so often it came down to wanting to project a Mediterranean national identity in a certain kind of way. Obviously, that's good for tourism. If you can be thought of as a Mediterranean country in this age of mass public tourist mobility to Mediterranean beach holidays that was opening up, and adjust that for the 20th century, the 21st century technology. And, you would see really something very similar in terms of how can we use this contest in a way that also have some synergies with tourist marketing. For instance, Croatia tried to do that in 2013, sending a piece of neo-traditional clapper music, for instance. There was this big push about getting international attention to clapper music in 2013. Croatia was joining the European Union at last. It's the music that communicates the Mediterranean, Italian side of Croatian heritage. Also, there'd been this campaign to get it on the intangible cultural heritage list. And it did all that, and it sent this clapper entry to Eurovision. And what I would argue they'd not thought enough about is what gives clapper music its intimacy and emotion when you hear it is it's meant to be sung by groups of friends who've been singing together for years. And they basically selected 6 different singers from 6 different clappers, put them together and put them on stage. I'm sure the people who took that approach to it had a good reason for doing that. But my sense was, seeing it actually missed what this, by then, incredibly popular style of popular music in Croatia can actually bring out with audiences.
Azurno nebo, čekamo zoru. Već je smadi golubica. Nasmiješena su im lica i poslije mnogo godina. Mome srcu draga sličica. Zajedno smo momke gledale, zajedno forivi šetale, pravile se da smo važne, a da smo pametne i snažne. Sanjale smo zemlje daleke.
So you're speaking already about the underlying politics of Eurovision. In fact, you're speaking about the politics of Eurovision when you're speaking about the Eurovision in one way or another. But last time when we spoke, what I found very curious to know how processes such as in Bosnia influence how they're presented in Eurovision, if at all they're presented in Eurovision.
The situation with Bosnia, really, I think it exemplifies how much the material politics, A, of the contest as an event, and, B, of each broadcaster that's participating, have to do with not just what actually gets on stage, on screen, but whether anything gets on screen at all. So we've been talking just now about, Bosnia being really one of the contenders in 2006, for instance. And then if you fast forward 10 years later, for several years, Bosnia hadn't been able to send an entry. And the only reason they could in 2016 was essentially a music producer from the Bosnian diaspora in Sweden offered to cover the costs of participating. And he also wrote the entry. Clearly, he was able to cover those costs quite significantly. So he and Bosnian Television managed to bring together 4 different Bosnian musicians. Iacob was there, who of course has, this profile across the region in hip hop. Ana Rutsna, the cellist. Dean was there, who'd represented Bosnia in 2004, and another singer called Dalal. So it would have been expensive to have just one of those, let alone 4. This still remains Bosnia's last Eurovision entry because the broadcaster has never been able to afford to participate again. And the story behind that actually goes right back to the failings of the Dayton constitutional system and the way that separatist politicians have been able to exploit that. So for those who don't know the background to this already, then essentially Milorad Dodik, as the most prominent separatist in the Republika Srpska entity, has tried to do anything he can to stop federal institutions working, essentially. So if there is any way that he and his party, the government of his entity, have been able to obstruct, hold back the budget to a federal institution, they will do it. That's where the protests over baby registration, which preceded the plenum protests in 2014, came from. That, because of this separatist obstructionism, the federal system for registering baby names had been jammed. And essentially what we see is the same thing with the federal broadcaster, and it cannot afford to even repay the debts it's incurred to the European Broadcasting Union, let alone fund a Eurovision entry every year, essentially because of this much bigger policy of separatist obstructionism that there has been from Republika Srpska to the federal institutions, and the way in which this situation has been allowed to continue on an ongoing basis by international actors, including the European Union. If you want to know why Bosnia hasn't got a Eurovision entry, ask Ursula von der Leyen and Milorad Dodik.
Is something that you also write extensively about is how queerness plays out in Eurovision. You've written more than one blog post on this, I've seen. So your work explores queer solidarity, among others, in race in Eurovision. In your view, is there a radical history of Eurovision? And if so, does any part of it connect to the Balkans?
I thought it was a great question when an editor from the History Workshop Online blog asked it to me. This is in the spring of 2024. And I thought that is something that can let me write about this event from a slightly different perspective to anything I've taken before. And like we were saying earlier, the way that every year Eurovision is being hosted somewhere else, it brings up the controversies over, national and European and very often queer belonging in a different set of countries end up in the spotlight every year. And sort of following this from year to year, what you end up with is a framework for thinking about these as dynamics across the whole of Europe and informed by as much as I'm able to know and understand about each of the localized national contexts. So there's always as well sort of some different either political theme or conceptual kind of question, which I find that I use Eurovision as a way of thinking through. Obviously by the time I got that invitation to do that blog in 2024, there had been weeks of debate, discussion, activism about the fact that Israel's broadcaster was going to be participating in 2024. This was the second time that the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement had called for boycott of Eurovision. The first time they'd done that when it wasn't being hosted in Israel, which had been the case in 2019. There is always, with not just Eurovision, but any other kind of either large-scale events or large-scale branding and communication exercise, there is always that question of when an event or an organisation or a state is projecting itself as LGBTQ plus friendly in some way. A, how far does that actually reflect how progressive it is inside? B, who is actually included in the freedoms that it says it's standing for and who isn't? C, what could that be deflecting from? Something like Eurovision, you've got the complication that there are individual musicians, often quite young, coming to this event, really sort of harnessing their own sort of personal narratives, experiences, identities through music and performance in order to do something which then is put out there on the airwaves, on the internet, as really representing, embodying their nation. There's the more abstract side of the public diplomacy. We've got people, performers, cultural workers at the heart of this as well. And one of the issues that was actually sort of manifesting itself in 2024 was if you've got an artist who, through their own affinities, does not actually feel comfortable now participating in Eurovision 2024, they probably can't get out of it. And there is immediately there is a labour rights question there, which hadn't been asked before. So that was on my mind as well as everything else. There had been probably the most significant on-camera protest there had been at Eurovision, being the flag protest for Hattori, who are this Icelandic anti-capitalist BDSM-influenced techno band did during the grand final voting sequence in 2019. They showed these Palestinian flag banners. Their broadcasters did get fined for that in the end. They'd had, over the course of their time in Tel Aviv, they wanted to critically engage with the event, and it's claimed to be non-political. So a lot of what we could call performance art really going on. They wanted to cooperate with Palestinian creatives and didn't get the chance to talk directly about that until after they were back in Iceland, basically. There was more in terms of their kind of action and critical engagement going on than viewers would have seen in the moment of that protest. So, you get this question which continues to be really relevant, that trying to do something critical or radical within the constraints of the event may never actually be able to be as radical an act as one might intend it to be. And yet, are there people who, for instance, reflected more or found out more or just became more aware of, the cause of solidarity with Palestine because of the way it was interjected into that live broadcast in 2019? Undoubtedly also there were. So, we have this situation with things like protest action, expressions of solidarity, which might never be able to fully achieve what they've set out to, and yet does that then mean that artists shouldn't make them? And that wasn't settled in 2024, it's not settled in 2025, and I know people listening are themselves going to have different views about this, besides anything that might have happened between now and we're speaking. Thinking through, is there a radical history of Eurovision? There's a field of history writing and activism which calls itself radical history in the first place. Again, there are different national expressions of it. I wanted to think about, okay, well, what's it mean to do radical history? In what ways have actions or entries we might call radical taken place within Eurovision, which has this rule, however it's been worded over the years, that it is a non-political event, political gestures, messages, etc. aren't allowed. I think this year we're starting to see it get closer to how the Olympics does things, in how it polices artist activism in the Olympics, athlete activism. And, also I think about the ways in which, performers who have come from radical scenes and part of Eurovision, and how do they manage within that context? How do they manage to create socially, politically engaged music performance in this contest, which is supposed to be completely non-political? And some of the best examples of that, I think, come from the post-Yugoslav space. If we think about Constructor from Serbia in 2022, if we think about Let 3 from Croatia in 2023, they managed to get audiences thinking about the politics of neoliberal and post-socialist healthcare, or aggressive patriarchal militarism, nuclear proliferation, and authoritarian leadership in the case of Let 3. And you can listen to Let 3, you can see their performance, and think, okay, that's got to be to do with Putin and Lukashenko. You can thinking about the career that they'd had in late socialist Yugoslavia, then in independent Croatia, the ways in which they have engaged with context created by the Yugoslav military, by Milosevic, by Tudjman. Can't say that what they're communicating is just about Putin and Lukashenko either. And I think there is something in radical and avant-garde performance cultures in societies where artists had to navigate socialist censorship and self-censorship, which I think has ended up translating in, very interesting ways. How have artists been able to use Eurovision to say maybe more than the organisers might have wanted them to, and yet to do that completely within the rules of the contest? Obviously, what Jamala was able to do in 2016 with 1944, she's able to commemorate the displacement, deportation of the Crimean Tatars under Stalin, something that the Ukrainian parliament had recently recognised as a genocide. She's able to express that, which obviously connects to her own family background. Her family had had that experience. Grandfather was living illegally occupied Crimea at that point, and she's able to do that in a way that A, you can't not think about 2014, B, it also connects with what we might call consensus European memory cultures, that culture which is really shaped by the sort of Western European consensus on how do we remember the World Wars. Just the image of the soldiers who come into the village and commit crimes there, that is really deep in French war memory, for instance. They'd essentially had a song about it, exactly that, in Eurovision the year before, and nobody had commented on that as political in the way that when Jamala was participating. It was marked in a way that the French having a war commemoration entry in 2015 just wasn't. So again, we're back again to that question of who gets to be at the centre of what's seen as the European consensus versus who is going to be conditionally on the edges of that. It's the same peripheralisation on so many scales again and again. Jamala would be really another example of how it is possible to use, in her case, the experiences of Ukraine's cultural industry, cultural movement, has had to try and hold on to national culture under generations of first imperial Russian, then Russocentric Soviet repression. And I think these kinds of experiences have ended up equipping musicians and their creative teams and the people who are developing these entries inside of broadcasters, equip them with ways to think much more creatively about what can you actually communicate through an event which has the rules that Eurovision does.
When we first spoke, you spoke about your positionality. It was the first point of our conversation, and clearly this plays a central role in your work because, as I can see and also read, you consciously reflect on it, on what it means. How has your own positionality shaped the way you approach knowledge production in and about the region?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think reflection is very much something that, to me, it feels like a basic commitment to, if I'm going to speak about or write about somewhere that I've not got first-hand knowledge of, it needs to be in a way which is going to make sense for people who actually have that experience, which I don't have. And, we're talking about this in the context of research on the post-Yugoslav space, but, I'd say the same, in fact, about, obviously, I'm from London, I work in Hull, I lived in Hull for a long time. It would be very easy for me to run my mouth off saying very uninformed things about Hull, and anyone who knew Hull better than me, hearing me say that, be very entitled to criticise me for that. And, that's never a position that I want to be in. I think the fact that the way that I started researching the post-Yugoslav space was through popular music. And the people who are doing the most in-depth work on that are ethnomusicologists. So the level of depth and knowledge and accuracy that I wanted to have, I'm going to say obviously, because to me it feels like it just should be obvious, is knowledge that would persuade somebody who already has that depth of knowledge that's not come out very well. I mean, I felt that the level of depth and knowledge and cultural and linguistic insights that I needed to have as a basic prerequisite to do that work needed to be something that someone with that degree of expertise would understand as also having authority, in effect. And I think I felt that was felt like a basic entry ticket if you're going to do research about, somewhere that isn't your day-to-day. And in fact, we're talking about positionality and diaspora. And in fact, my day-to-day, although based in British universities, was also very shaped by friendships with a lot of colleagues, the same academic and often also generational age as me, whose backgrounds had taken them through diasporic routes from various parts of the post-Yugoslav region to working in the settings, that we encountered each other in. And I was very often in the, position of complaining with my everyday academic friendship group about things that annoyed me in some piece of Anglophone scholarship or another, and which also annoyed whoever it was I was talking to. And I felt very much that I know what I don't want to do, because I see so many examples of ways in which the region gets simplified, romanticised, and that is not something that I want to even accidentally be doing.
And that brings us almost to the end of this conversation, given that we've spoken about Eurovision today and popular culture. I want to know, what is your favorite Eurovision song?
So what is my favourite Eurovision song? I could say the Croatian one in '96, which at the time made me think, okay, I want to hear more music that sounds like that. And then I started following what was happening more in the Croatian selections after that. This was just about when it was becoming more possible to get access to music from European countries that weren't coming through the commercial popular music market in the UK. So I could say that one. I could say Croatia again in 2006, just because that ended up focusing so many things I've written about ever since, but not all going to be Croatian, in terms of sort of redefining what Eurovision performance could do with regional and national folklore. Ruslana in 2004 from Ukraine was a turning point. I could say Let 3, Croatia in 2003, again, just because of how much there is to appreciate about their political creative practice and the extent to which they managed to communicate that within the Eurovision format. I remember seeing a video before Eurovision at one of the pre-contest fan parties which get held in various cities. And they were in London, and as part of their set, they'd done their song, and then they have a version of a Dinaric folk song, Ero, which comes from originally this 1930s folk opera about the Dinaric Mountains. They wanted to sort of use it to make one of the satirical comments about patriarchal, nationalist, chauvinist masculinity that they're always making. They'd had it on an album that I'd written about, so they used this song as the other thing in their set, and quite possibly because they wanted to introduce themselves and their values to the Eurovision fan audience who didn't know them, they were waving a Progress Pride flag. I think as a queer person who has researched Croatian nationalism and militarism a lot, and there have been certain experiences which I've had as a result of that, which were not particularly pleasant, seeing that reconfiguration of symbols that they were making in that moment. And this is a band who have been supporting LGBTQ plus causes and, fighting against sexual hypocrisy for literally decades. So that was quite a special moment. In terms of what managed to bring together more aspects of music that I appreciate and I thought you could fit into one song, probably Go Away from Ukraine in 2021. So I can't pick out one of them, but it's always that question of, if I had to pick one, what would it be? And I don't think I can, because I think actually it's the way that things assemble and the way that things resonate with each other, which ends up forming a lot of my critical and interpretive lenses. And so I can't even pick a favourite Eurovision entry.
And then when we spoke, you said you brought back a lot of CDs while you were doing research in Croatia. But now I want to know, beyond the CDs, if there is one thing you could bring from the Balkans to the UK that is missing for you here, what would it be?
I think right now what I'd bring back is really the energy of the students in Serbia who are demanding democratic accountability from their government on such a large scale. We need that everywhere.
That's a very meaningful ending to this conversation. Thank you so much, Catherine, for accepting my invitation and for sharing your rich knowledge with the audience of Diaspora Speaking.
Thank you for such great questions.